Mom? I asked. Why are you closing the blinds? Our neighborhood has a peeping Tom, she responded, peering with a single eye into the gloom of suburbia in winter. I didn't know exactly what my mother was looking for, but I knew that she was nervous. And that made me nervous. I was 8 years old that Christmas. And the words Peeping Tom meant nothing to me. I knew that peepers was another word for eye, and I couldn't help but imagine the mad rolling eyeballs and black hat of Judge Doom from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It had been over a month since I'd seen that movie, but it still gave me nightmares. The next morning, however, I had to face something even more frightening, to my 8-year-old mind, than a peeping Tom. My mother insisting on walking me to the bus stop. Just to be safe, she said. But she wouldn't have to endure the sneers and laughter of classmates for the rest of the year. It started as soon as I got on the bus. A loud chant from the back of Mama's boy, that felt like it would never end. Trying to ignore them, I looked out the window. And what I saw chilled my blood. My mother was walking home, alone. And a figure in the bushes was watching her. A figure in a broad-billed black hat and battered black trench coat. From the fast-moving school bus window, I couldn't see its crazy round eyes, but I just knew that they were there all the same. "Wait!" I screamed. "Stop the bus!" Laughter. The chants of Mama's boy grew louder. The driver ignored me. At school, I couldn't focus on anything. What if the peeping Tom had crept up on my mother with those impossibly long, silent steps? What if it had wrapped a filthy, black-gloved hand around her mouth and dragged her away? What if... I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw my mother waiting expectantly at the bus stop that afternoon. Instead of trying to wriggle away, I grabbed her hand and I squeezed it tight. There were worse things than my classmates teasing out there, I realized. Things that hid in the bushes and crept through the dark. Things like a peeping Tom. That evening, I muted my video games to listen to my mother's conversation with one of her friends on our street, Evelyn. Apparently, Evelyn had come out of the shower to find a man in a black hat and trench coat rummaging through her drawers. Why anyone would want to steal dumb girls' clothes was beyond me, but Evelyn sure seemed to be plenty scared about it. Although, if the peeping Tom was anything like what I imagined, I would have been too. My mother invited Evelyn to stay the night with us. I breathed a sigh of relief, and she refused. Evelyn smelled like cloves, and was always asking me questions when I just wanted to play. The police were parked outside her house, Evelyn told my mother, and besides, Claire would be home soon. Claire was the woman who lived with Evelyn, although I wasn't exactly sure how they knew each other. My mother did my best to reassure our neighbor before she hung up. "At least there hasn't been any more violence," she said in a low voice. I could hear Evelyn's response. It sounded like she was shushing my mother, hurrying to get off the line. My mother's words were far from comforting. How did she know that this peeping Tom hadn't hit a bunch of dead bodies in the woods by the park? Maybe following people and breaking into their houses was just the beginning. Maybe the peeping Tom was just getting warmed up. And why had she said any more violence? Had this sort of thing happened before? Was it just something normal adults had to deal with? At 8 years old, I had no idea. I closed my curtains that night, just to be safe, as my mother had said. But that didn't make it any easier to sleep. Especially once I heard that fleshy, squelching noise against the glass. It sounded awful lot like a tongue. I sat up in bed and Whatever was out there began to scrape long fingernails on the glass. "Mom?" I whispered. The noises grew louder, frantic and hungry. Any minute now, it would break through. "Mom!" I screamed. As my mother rustled out of bed, running footsteps across the roof. The noises grew louder, frantic and hungry. Any minute now, it would break through. "Mom!" I screamed. As my mother rustled out of bed, running footsteps across the roof outside of my window, then disappeared. My mother saw me pointing at the curtains and yanked them back, baseball bat at the ready. But there was nothing outside but darkness. "Peeping. Tom," I panted. My mom stuck her head out looking for evidence. Frowned. "Honey, are you sure you didn't just have a bad dream?" I shook my head. Couldn't she see the spit streak on the glass? "Well, I'll call it in, but I don't want you to worry. The police are out looking for the bad guy, and they're going to catch him." I thought about how rapidly those footsteps crossed the roof. I doubted the police could move that fast. I slept in my mother's room that night, and although she constantly reassured me that it was just a dream, I noticed that she lay the bat within reach by the nightstand. The next night, Claire showed up crying at our porch just before midnight. Everyone introduced her as Evelyn's friend, but even at 8 years old, I knew that there was a lot more to it than that. It was how Claire touched Evelyn's back when they came over for my mom's parties, how they laughed and finished each other's sentences. And that was the problem. Eavesdropping from the top of the stairs, I picked up on the drift right away. Evelyn had disappeared. And while Claire was sure that the neighborhood Peeping Tom was responsible, the police had fixated on Evelyn's deviant lifestyle. And that meant Claire. In those days, certain types of relationships just weren't talked about or tolerated by most people, and anyone who participated in them was suspicious by default. Of course, I didn't understand any of that back then, but I did focus on one detail that Claire confessed to my mother. The police cruiser parked outside of Evelyn and Claire's home had left its position when a sighting of the Peeping Tom had been called in. My sighting. My guts knotted up. I was partially responsible for Evelyn's disappearance. The Peeping Tom might have planned it all along, scaring me, distracting the police patrol, then breaking in to take Evelyn. Back in my room, I gripped my pocket knife until my knuckles turned white, swearing, like I'd seen in movies, that I'd give that damn Peeping Tom what he had coming to him. But it was not to be. After Evelyn's disappearance, the sightings of the Peeping Tom came to an end. The intimidating, shark-like police cruisers that had patrolled our neighborhood were gone, leaving behind only empty windows of the home that Claire and Evelyn had shared. They stared at me accusingly whenever I walked by. While Claire was ultimately found not guilty of Evelyn's murder, the experience left a rotten taste in her mouth. No one was surprised when she left without a forwarding address. I didn't think about her again until a few years later, when my friends and I were trying our first cigarette in a ramshackle shed that we'd found in the woods behind the park. My first lungful made me cough and lurch forward. My foot went straight through the rotten floor. There was a ladder underneath. It led down into a bare concrete basement that had probably been sealed off for years, but the scent down there was familiar. Evelyn's clove perfume. I shuddered, made up a lame excuse, and hurried home. I felt the need to tell an adult what I'd found, but by the time I reached my front door, I was having second thoughts. If I told anyone about the shed, I'd have to explain what we were doing there. I didn't want to get my friends in trouble. I could still smell that nasty cigarette smoke in my clothes. What if the adults could smell it too? Besides, I didn't have any real evidence, just a familiar scent. I decided to hide my clothes at the bottom of the laundry pile, take a shower, and keep my mouth shut. My family moved away a few months later, and I forgot all about the Peeping Tom and my discovery in the shed. Until last night. Something happened that jogged my memory. I went to bed early and I woke up to my wife shaking me and whispering in my ear, "Honey, I think there's a guy in the bushes beside our house." I sprung out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside the nightstand. The grip felt cold in my hand as I ran to the patio door. I flicked on the outside light and jumped outside. "Hey!" I shouted, hoping that I sounded more intimidating than I felt. "Who's there?" There was no response, but I could feel eyes on me. I couldn't help but imagine the eyes from my childhood nightmare. Huge, bloodshot, and insane. The eyes of the Peeping Tom. A cold sweat broke out over my forehead as I jostled the first bush with the bat, hoping, praying, that I wouldn't see some awful thing draped in a nasty trench coat and a broad-brimmed hat staring back at me from the other side of the leaves. My wife, Kim, stood in the kitchen, one hand on a butcher's knife and the other on her phone, ready to call the police. As I approached the third, I heard Kim scream. Nothing was hiding in the branches, but I turned around in time to see a long shadow scurry across our backyard and disappear into the trees beside the power lines. The figure that cast it wore a filthy trench coat and a familiar black hat. We called the authorities immediately. They told us that no one nearby had reported being a stalker. They'd increased patrols in the area. There wasn't much more they could do, and I resolved to take matters into my own hands. What disturbed me the most was that the Peeping Tom I'd seen had looked identical to the one from my childhood nightmares, and it shouldn't have been possible. And yet, spurred on by my disquieting memories, I did something I'd promised myself I'd never do. I started searching my childhood neighborhoods on social media. Kim was snoring softly in the bedroom beside my office. The doors were locked and I had my trusty bat beside my desk, but none of it made me feel any more secure in light of the new information I uncovered. It seemed that almost all of my childhood friends had ordinary lives, some heartbreaks, some joy, sprinkling of drama, the occasional run-in with the police, drug addiction, or wildly successful career. For almost all of them, the stories were nearly the same. But for the families who lived on Maidsway Court, my street back then, it was a different story. Evelyn wasn't the only one who'd vanished. Over the past 20 years, there had been 5 disappearances, 3 unexplained deaths, and 2 suicides. Something horrible had happened to my childhood neighbors. Dread settled into my gut like a cold stone when I recalled their houses, their faces, their quirks, the junk they had in their yards. The moment that I looked at a street view map of my old street, the horrifying patterns became obvious. The bad luck haunting my childhood neighbors moved from left to right. Beginning at Evelyn's house, even though almost everyone on my street had moved away in the years following Evelyn's disappearance, another odd coincidence, the pattern remained the same. Someone, or something, was destroying our lives one by one, and my family was next. I called my mother right away, but she didn't pick up. That was disquieting enough in itself. My mother always left her phone at full volume day or night and always kept it by her side. I shook Kim awake, bundled her in a coat, and brought her down to the car. I knew that my incoherent explanation of where we were going and what we were doing had scared her, but if I was right, she wasn't nearly as scared as she should have been. I drove in white-knuckled silence, pulling into my mother's driveway after completing the 2-hour drive in less than an hour 20. Every light in the house was on, and the curtains of the open living room window were blowing in the breeze. I rushed inside, bat in hand. Kim and I searched my mother's house again and again. But there was no sign of her. My mother's bed was a mess. I could already imagine how it might have gone. The man in black could have slipped in through the window, tiptoed upstairs, pressed a chloroform cloth over her mouth, and dragged her out the back door. Into the woods. My mother's address book lay on her nightstand. I flipped it open and struck gold. She'd kept in touch with the people from Midway Court. I had at least 5 phone numbers to try. While Kim busied herself with shutting the living room windows and checking the other locks, I called my ex-neighbor's phone numbers in the order that they were written. "Hello?" A gruff man answered on the 4th ring. "Dave, this is Bryce Leeds. You lived in Midway Court in the 90s, remember?" "Bryce, do you have any idea what fucking time it is? I got work in the morning." "Look, I know. I'm sorry, but my mother's missing," I pleaded. "I need to know what you know." The next number wasn't one that I would have called if I had a choice. Claire. Even though I was only a child at the time, I still felt some guilt over how everyone treated her. She picked up right away. "This is Bryce Leeds," I said immediately. My mother's missing, and so it's true." Claire gasped. "There really is no escape." No escape from what?" "But everyone on Maidstone Court did, when you were just a toddler." What are you talking about? Look, my mother is—" "Listen," Claire shouted. I sat in the unmade bed and did as I was told. Back then, there was a hobo who lived in a shack in the woods by the name of Tom Calforth. Tom was— how can I put it? A dirty old man. He said filthy things to every woman and girl he saw. Sometimes he even followed us home. He got off on our fear, I think, and he took to spying on women of Maidstone Court every night. He'd creep right up to our windows and even snuck into our homes, left traces of his presence just to make us feel unsafe. The police would haul him off, but with no physical evidence, they could never hold him for long. One day he approached Evelyn while she was working alone in the garage. Spewing his usual filth, he got so close that she could smell his foul breath on her face. And when he tried to touch her, Claire paused. You have to understand how afraid we were back then. Everyone was at a boiling point. We just wanted him, that man we called Dirty Tom, out of our lives. That's why Evelyn hit him in the head with a shovel. He went down hard, bleeding, and swore that he'd sue her and take everything we had. So she hit him again. And again. Dave, across the street, and your mother heard the screams and came running. Eventually, everyone else did too. No one felt shock or horror at what Evelyn had done. We felt relieved. Dirty Tom Calforth was finally out of our lives, and nobody would miss him. We buried him in the woods beside his shed. And we never told a soul. That's horrible. But what does it have to do with my mother going missing? Don't you get it? Dirty Tom isn't resting peacefully. He's getting his revenge, hurting our families one by one. The front door downstairs opened. It was Kim. I sprung to my feet, grabbed my bat, and ran into the hallway. My mother was coming in the door. She jumped when she saw me. Bryce! What are you doing here? I just got a call from the hospital saying you were in the ER, but when I drove there, did you see Kim on your way in? I grabbed my mother's shoulders. No, should I have? She sounded puzzled. What's going on? Get in the car. I'm gonna pay a visit to Tom Calforth. My mother's jaw dropped. I talked to Claire, Mom. I know everything, and... Okay, I understand, but we have to finish this. Whatever Tom Calforth became, I think it got Kim. The sky was brightening when he pulled into the empty parking lot of my childhood park 2 hours later, but the thick fog made everything gray. The street lamps looked monstrous, and the forest looked hungry. We couldn't see more than 5 feet away. Every sound in the forest made us jump. I held my mother's hand as we walked uncertainly towards the shed, where I'd smoked my first cigarette. unaware that a human monster who filled our neighborhood with fear was buried just a stone's throw away. My mother's hand shook as she pointed to a weedy patch of dirt behind the shed. I jammed the shovel I'd taken from her garage into the dirt, and I started digging. I barely felt the blisters forming on my hand. My head was too full of images of my wife being dragged through the woods at inhuman speeds, and the horrific, very real possibility that a dead pervert's mindless revenge might have stolen her away forever. The blade of my shovel hit something that wasn't dirt. We buried him in an old suitcase. Dave said that it would help keep animals away from the corpse, my mother stammered. The black plastic was worn, but intact. As I shifted away more dirt, I saw that even the zipper was still closed. Almost. Would a bony hand shoot out and grab my wrist if I tried to open the gruesome container? I hesitated. And then I thought about Kim. I handed my mother my car keys. If anything happens to me, I murmured, run. Don't look back. My mother shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Something moved in the foggy woods and we both jumped. It might have been an owl or a deer, but the message was clear. I had to hurry. To my surprise, the zipper still worked. The mist swirled around my mother and I like a living thing as I threw open the battered suitcase. Kim's terrified eyes stared up at me. She had been forcibly bent and twisted to fit into the tiny compartment, and her limbs were locked in place by the hands and feet of a rotting corpse. A corpse wearing the remains of a broad-brimmed black hat and a dirty trench coat. The corpse of Dirty Tom Calfrith. With a cry, I jumped into the hole and pried the rigor mortis-locked fingers off my wife's wrists. I grabbed her beneath her armpits and dragged her away from the eyeless skull, grinning up at us. By night, Dirty Tom's vengeful spirit was a powerful and murderous force, but by day, he was just rotting bones in a suitcase. I held Kim. She wasn't ready to speak, but I knew that she would when the time was right. My mother lifted up the other tools that I had brought from my mother's garage. Charcoal and a gas can. She poured them over the suitcase, said a prayer, and dropped the match. We stood in a circle, and we watched the past burn, hoping that it would forgive us. Hoping that maybe, this time, it wouldn't come back to haunt us. For those of you guys that like to listen to stories, which I assume is all of you since, you're here, Chilling is currently introducing Chilling 2.0, which brings in a bunch of new features and a fresh new look. Most importantly, Chilling is now free. All you guys out there who are like, hey, I don't want to sign up for a subscription, why don't they make Chilling free? Well, they did. They listened to you. Isn't that great? It's an app that actually listened to you because it's what you wanted. Now, they do that. There's new content including full-length novels, podcasts, more. New features including creator profiles, the ability to follow your favorite narrators, like me, and authors. There's some video content that should be showing up soon, if not started already. So once again, like I said, start listening free today. There's links in the description down below if you guys can check that out. And if not, then hey, you're the one who's missing out. Once again, that's the Chilling app. A big thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Jakob Fenske, Stephanie Butler, Jordan Humble, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, BrimstonePandemonium, Caltuna, William Wellington, Emma, Brenna LaQueda Canizales, Smiley the Psychotic, Dante Kinkade, SimbasBloodyMojo, Mephistopheles, CursepoxPrimarch, Bastion Beefcake, M, Jesus Cornejo, Yargul, Clownable, Amber Clark, Jay Kierns, Dakota Lane Whetstone, Himbo Jerry, Crusader Chocobo, Adamarius, Estebean, Nate Cull, Our Minsect Time, Xylobones, Angelus, Seclude, Salty Surprise, Lebeda Galvin, That Creepy Chick, Red Shadow Cat, Turtleman, Carolinian, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Ika Limchalk, Dirty Diver 030, Matt Bach, Voice of Sand, Fikamel, Melted Lake, Tali Sue, William King, Darth Miver, Sashi Suzaku, Coconut 509, Stricket, Freddy Krueger, Lisa Cottrell, Hades Nephew, Acid System, Mog, Kiwi the Sloth, Fester's Lampshade, Nico Kyle, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. To all of you guys, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you for being a huge support to me. Thank you to everybody who's in the description down below, and thank you to everyone who can even support $1 just on Patreon to help keep the content coming.